The first light of dawn rose slowly, almost imperceptibly, over the long, winding green ribbon of the Nile, and in that quiet, suspended moment, the land that would one day be known to history as ancient Egypt revealed itself once again, not as something new, but as something enduring. It did not announce itself through sudden beginnings or dramatic upheaval, but through continuity, through repetition so gentle that it felt timeless, a landscape shaped not by conquest or urgency, but by countless seasons of observation, patience, and quiet adaptation. Long before stone monuments shaped the horizon or kings ruled from vast temples, small communities learned to live in rhythm with the river whose behavior defined every aspect of existence, shaping their waking hours, their labor, and even the pace of their thoughts as they drifted into sleep beneath open skies. Each year, with remarkable and comforting regularity, the Nile rose from its banks. It was not a violent surge, nor a sudden torrent that arrived without warning, but a steady, predictable tide, creeping outward across the floodplain, spreading dark, fertile silt over the fields, paths, and boundaries that mark human space. Villages watched as familiar landmarks disappeared beneath the calm surface of the water, not with fear, but with trust. This inundation was the heartbeat of the valley, a pulse that sustained life rather than threatened it. When the flood finally withdrew, returning slowly to its channel, it left behind soil renewed and glistening in the sun, ready to receive life once again. This cycle did not bring anxiety or uncertainty, but reassurance, a promise kept year after year by the natural world itself. Over generations, the people learned to trust it completely, to expect it as surely as the sunrise, and to build their lives, their calendars, and their understanding of time around its return. When the waters receded, the land emerged beneath the warming sun as a quiet mosaic of dark earth and lingering pools. Seeds were pressed gently into the damp soil with practiced care, an act that blended labor with ritual, repetition with hope. Hands moved with confidence, guided not by written instruction, but by memory stored in muscle and tradition passed without words. Canals were cleared of the seasoned silt, embankments inspected, and tools repaired as the rhythm of cultivation resumed without urgency. There was no need to rush what could not be forced. There was a time for resting, a time for planting, and a time for harvesting, and the river dictated them all, teaching patience through consistency. The Nile was never silent, even in its calmest moments. Its banks teemed with life that signaled the health of the world itself. In the dense papyrus thickets along the marshy edges, birds rose in vast clouds at dawn, their wings beating together in patterns that seemed almost intentional. Fish stirred beneath the surface, reeds whispered in the breeze, and insects hummed softly in the heat. Hippopotamuses moved through the water with deceptive calm, powerful and unpredictable, while crocodiles rested motionless along the silt banks, ancient and watchful. To live beside the Nile was to live alongside forces both generous and dangerous, to understand that abundance and risk existed together. Humans were not masters of this environment, but participants within it, adapting themselves to its moods rather than attempting to dominate it. This profound reliability shaped the Egyptian understanding of the world itself. Nature was not viewed as chaotic or hostile, nor as something to be conquered and reshaped, but as a system governed by order, balance, and repetition. The river did not need to be controlled, it needed to be respected, observed, and understood. Early settlements formed naturally along the river banks where water, soil, and sunlight met in gentle harmony. Villages were built from the materials the river provided, sun-dried mud brick shaped from the very earth it renewed, reeds gathered from its marshes, wood carried along its current. Homes were modest, low, and earth-toned, blending into the landscape rather than standing apart from it, reflecting a desire to belong rather than to impose. These homes were designed with care rather than ornament. Thick walls cooled the interior during the relentless heat of the day and retained warmth through the cooler nights. Doorways faced prevailing winds, courtyards allowed light and air to circulate, and rooftops provided spaces for rest beneath the stars. Life within these settlements unfolded with comforting regularity. Children learned the moods of the river before they learned to count. They recognized the signs of the flood by watching the waterline and reading the expressions of elders. Knowledge passed through observation rather than instruction, through repetition rather than explanation. Elders marked time not by numbered years, but by remembered floods, by good harvests and difficult seasons, by changes in the river's voice. As generations passed, the Nile became more than a source of water or food. It became a calendar, a collective memory, and a living presence woven into belief itself. Its annual flood divided time into 3 seasons: inundation, growth, and harvest, shaping labor and rest alike. When the fields lay beneath water, agricultural work paused naturally, and people turned to other tasks. Canals were repaired, tools were shaped, stone transported, and communal projects undertaken. These periods of shared labor reinforced cooperation and unity, reminding communities that survival depended not on individual effort alone, but on collective balance. When planting returned, fields were worked together, harvests awaited with confidence rather than fear. Unlike lands where rainfall failed or soil exhausted quickly, the Nile Valley offered renewal without migration. People returned to the same ground year after year, century after century, building memory into place. Fields carried stories, canals remembered hands that shaped them, and paths were worn smooth by generations walking the same routes. Stability allowed traditions to deepen, skills to refine, and relationships between people and land to grow sacred rather than transactional. This continuity encouraged restraint rather than urgency. Life was not driven by extraction, but by endurance. Crops could not be rushed, floods could not be commanded, and so humans learned to adapt. They observed subtle changes, responded rather than forced, and shaped a worldview that valued harmony over dominance. Excess was seen as a threat to balance, not a guarantee of security. The river taught that survival depended on patience, and patience became cultural instinct. Over time, the rhythms of the Nile shaped belief itself. The return of the flood reassured people that order would always be restored, even after absence or hardship. Low floods and high floods came, but the cycle endured. Renewal was always possible. This expectation shaped emotional life, encouraging calm acceptance rather than fear of change. Communities living hundreds of miles apart followed the same rhythms, paused and resumed labor together, and lived within the same temporal framework. The river bound them into one shared pulse. In this way, the Nile shaped more than agriculture or settlement. It shaped thought, behavior, and identity. It taught that life could endure through balance rather than force, that continuity mattered more than speed, and that stability was something to be maintained rather than conquered. From this relationship between river and people emerged a civilization defined not by sudden invention, but by patience, observation, and respect for rhythms older than memory itself. This was the foundation upon which ancient Egypt would rise, a world built alongside nature, carried forward by the steady, eternal flow of water and time. As the villages along the Nile grew steadily in number, size, and confidence, the quiet balance that had once sustained small, closely knit communities began to stretch across wider distances. What had worked for a single settlement no longer sufficed for an entire region. Fields expanded beyond familiar boundaries, canals crossed shared land, and the storage of surplus grain became a matter of collective survival rather than household concern. Disputes emerged that could not always be resolved through memory or custom alone, and coordination became essential. From these practical and unavoidable needs, the earliest forms of leadership began to take shape, not through sudden conquest or displays of violence, but through responsibility, trust, and the ability to see beyond individual interests. Leadership in this early age did not announce itself with crowns or thrones. It emerged quietly, shaped by those who proved capable of organizing labor, settling disputes, and maintaining harmony during moments when cooperation mattered most. These individuals were often chosen not for strength or lineage, but for judgment, experience, and reliability. They understood the river's rhythms, the timing of floods, and the delicate balance required to ensure that no family was left without seed or water. Authority was earned through service, and power was understood as stewardship rather than domination. Over time, clusters of settlements began to recognize shared interests and common rhythms. Regional identities slowly formed along the length of the river. To the south, where the Nile ran narrow between stone cliffs and desert hills, communities developed practices suited to a confined landscape. This region came to be known as Upper Egypt. To the north, where the river spread outward into a broad, fertile delta of marshes and channels, Lower Egypt took shape, defined by abundance and openness. Each region developed its own symbols, rituals, and local traditions, shaped by geography and environment, yet both were bound inseparably by the same river and the same seasonal cycles. Despite these differences, neither region existed in isolation. The Nile itself served as a constant reminder that balance depended on cooperation rather than division. What happened upstream affected life downstream, and a failure in one region could ripple outward across the entire valley. This interdependence encouraged communication, exchange, and negotiation. Trade moved grain, pottery, stone, and ideas along the river, and with it came shared customs and growing cultural cohesion. Slowly, the idea emerged that the land itself was incomplete while divided, that unity was not merely advantageous but necessary for stability. Leadership during this formative period remained deeply embedded within community life. Early rulers were not distant figures removed from the fields and canals. They walked the land, inspected embankments, oversaw irrigation work, and mediated conflicts face to face. Their authority rested on their ability to maintain order in moments of uncertainty. If floods failed or disputes intensified, it was their responsibility to respond in ways that preserved harmony rather than deepened division. A leader who failed in this task risked losing legitimacy, for power was conditional upon balance. As interactions between Upper and Lower Egypt increased, cultural exchange deepened. Shared practices began to appear in burial customs, pottery styles, and ritual objects, signaling a growing sense of unity across distance. The idea of unification did not arise suddenly as a single act of conquest, but gradually as a symbolic solution to the challenges of coordination and balance. The joining of the two lands promised stability, ensuring that resources, labor, and ritual practice could be aligned rather than fragmented. When unification finally occurred, it was remembered not simply as a political victory, but as an act of cosmic alignment. The ruler who united the two lands was celebrated as one who restored order rather than imposed control. Kingship transformed from local leadership into a role of universal responsibility. The king became the living symbol of unity, embodying both Upper and Lower Egypt, often represented through the wearing of the double crown. Through him, harmony was believed to flow between people, land, and the unseen forces that governed existence. This transformation reshaped the nature of power in Egypt for generations to come. Authority no longer relied on constant assertion or fear, but on ritual legitimacy and continuity. The king's role was to ensure that floods arrived in their proper season, that rituals were performed correctly, that justice was upheld, and that chaos remained outside the borders of ordered life. Power was framed as obligation rather than privilege, a burden carried on behalf of the land itself. The ruler stood as a mediator between humanity and the wider cosmos, responsible for maintaining balance at every level. With the rise of kingship came the earliest structures of the state. Administration expanded slowly and deliberately. Officials were appointed to supervise labor and manage resources. Scribes recorded grain, land, and offerings, allowing decisions to travel across distance without disrupting daily life. Priests maintained ritual order, reinforcing the spiritual foundations of authority. Together, these roles formed a quiet machinery of governance, largely unseen by ordinary villagers but deeply influential in sustaining stability. Early monuments and ceremonial objects reflected this shift toward permanence. Though modest compared to later achievements, they marked a growing desire to anchor authority in memory rather than momentary power. Stone began to replace mud brick in important structures, signaling an intention to endure. Yet even as central authority strengthened, local traditions persisted. Change unfolded slowly, absorbed into existing practices rather than replacing them outright. In this way, the first kingdoms of Egypt emerged through patience rather than upheaval. Power took shape as a stabilizing force, designed to coordinate cooperation and protect continuity rather than disrupt daily life. This early model of leadership laid the foundation for one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history, a civilization whose strength grew not from rapid expansion, but from the careful, deliberate shaping of power to serve balance, time, and endurance. Mot governed the natural world in ways that felt both visible and reassuring. The rising and setting of the sun, the dependable return of the seasons, and the steady rhythm of the river's flood were all understood as expressions of this underlying order. Nothing happened by accident, and nothing was truly random. Even uncertainty was believed to exist within a larger pattern that would eventually restore balance. This belief provided emotional stability as much as practical guidance. When floods were low or harvests thin, the people did not see the world as broken, but as temporarily misaligned, requiring correction rather than despair. Within society, Mot shaped every level of behavior. Justice was not merely a system of punishment, but an effort to restore equilibrium when it had been disturbed. Laws existed not to impose authority, but to maintain harmony between individuals, families, and the wider community. Truthfulness, fairness, restraint, and respect were considered essential virtues because they prevented disorder from spreading. A dishonest act, however small, was believed to ripple outward, weakening the balance that sustained all life. The responsibility to uphold Mot fell most heavily upon the king. As ruler, he was not simply a political leader, but the guardian of cosmic order. His legitimacy rested not on force or lineage alone, but on his ability to maintain balance between people, land, and the unseen forces of the universe. Rituals performed in temples, offerings made to the gods, and festivals aligned with celestial events were all acts intended to reinforce Mot. If these rituals were neglected or performed incorrectly, it was believed that chaos could return in the form of drought, disease, or social unrest. Temples became centers where Mot was actively sustained. Priests recited hymns, maintained sacred spaces, and followed strict routines designed to preserve purity and order. These daily practices were not dramatic displays, but quiet repetitions carried out with precision. Each gesture, word, and offering reaffirmed the stability of the world. In this way, religion was not separate from daily life, but woven directly into it, reinforcing the same values that governed farming, trade, and governance. Ordinary people also lived under the guidance of Mot. Farmers measured their work according to fairness, sharing water and land responsibly. Craftsmen followed established standards, ensuring quality and consistency. Merchants were expected to trade honestly, using correct weights and measures. Even within the household, harmony between family members was seen as a reflection of cosmic order. Life was not divided into sacred and ordinary moments. Every action carried moral weight. This belief extended beyond life itself into the realm of death. Egyptians believed that after death, the heart of the individual would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at. A heart made heavy by dishonesty, cruelty, or imbalance would fail the test, while a heart that had lived in accordance with Ma'at would pass into eternal life. This judgment reinforced the importance of ethical behavior throughout life, for eternity depended not on wealth or status, but on balance and truth. Ma'at also provided continuity across time. While rulers changed and dynasties rose and fell, the principle itself remained constant. Each king presented himself as a restorer of Ma'at, correcting the mistakes of the past and reaffirming order for the future. This continuity allowed Egypt to endure periods of instability without losing its identity. Even in times of decline, the goal was never revolution, but restoration. Through Ma'at, the Egyptians developed a worldview that valued harmony over ambition and stability over excess. It taught patience in the face of hardship and restraint in times of abundance. Rather than seeking to dominate the world, they sought to align themselves with it. This principle shaped law, religion, governance, and personal conduct, forming the invisible structure upon which the entire civilization rested. In understanding Ma'at, we see how ancient Egypt sustained itself for thousands of years. Its endurance was not accidental, nor was it solely the result of natural advantage. It was the product of the shared belief that order mattered, that balance must be protected, and that every individual played a role in maintaining the fragile harmony of existence. Through Ma'at, the Egyptians found a way to live not against the world, but within it, preserving stability through attention, care, and respect for the unseen forces that held everything together. As Egyptian civilization matured and its cities grew more complex, the spiritual life of the people unfolded not as a separate realm removed from daily existence, but as something inseparably woven into the landscape itself. The gods of ancient Egypt were not distant beings residing in unreachable heavens, nor abstract forces beyond human comprehension. They were present everywhere, in the movement of the sun across the sky, in the fertile silt left behind by the Nile, in the desert winds that scoured the edges of the valley, and in the silence of the night when the stars traced their eternal paths. Religion did not interrupt life in Egypt, it explained it, grounded it, and gave it meaning. The Egyptian pantheon grew organically over time, shaped by geography, tradition, and local experience. Each region developed deities connected to its environment and history, yet these local gods were never isolated. They blended, merged, and aligned into a broader spiritual system that reflected the unity of the land itself. Ra embodied the sun and the cycle of creation and renewal. Osiris represented death, regeneration, and the promise of continued existence beyond life. Isis symbolized protection, healing, and devotion, while Horus embodied kingship and rightful rule. These gods were not merely worshipped, they were understood as active participants in the maintenance of Ma'at, the cosmic balance that sustained the universe. Temples emerged as the physical spaces where this relationship between humanity and the divine was carefully maintained. Unlike later religious structures designed for large congregations, Egyptian temples were not places of public gathering in the modern sense. They were sacred houses for the gods, constructed with precision, symbolism, and restraint. Each temple was aligned with cosmic principles, often oriented toward the rising or setting sun, or positioned along the Nile to mirror the flow of life itself. The approach to a temple was deliberate and gradual, moving from the ordinary world into increasingly sacred spaces, reinforcing the idea that the divine required respect, preparation, and purity. Within these temples, Priests carried out daily rituals designed to sustain the gods and, through them, the balance of the world. These rituals followed strict routines repeated with exactness day after day. Statues of the gods were bathed, clothed, fed, and honored as living beings. Incense filled the air, hymns were recited softly, and offerings of food, drink, and flowers were placed before the divine presence. These acts were not symbolic gestures alone. They were believed to be essential for maintaining cosmic stability. If the gods were neglected, might itself could weaken, allowing chaos to seep back into the world. The temple was also a center of knowledge and economic life. Granaries, workshops, and storerooms surrounded sacred spaces, supporting both religious practice and the broader community. Priests were scholars, astronomers, healers, and administrators, trained to observe celestial movements, interpret omens, and preserve sacred texts. Their authority came not from political power, but from their role as caretakers of order. Through ritual precision and continuity, they ensured that the divine rhythms of the universe remained aligned with human activity. Beyond the temples, the sacred landscape extended across the entire valley. Sacred groves, riverbanks, desert edges, and burial grounds all held spiritual significance. The boundary between cultivated land and desert was especially meaningful. The fertile fields represented life, order, and might, while the desert symbolized chaos, danger, and the unknown. This contrast shaped religious imagination, reinforcing the belief that order had to be actively maintained against ever-present disorder. Gods associated with protection, boundaries, and transition were especially important, guarding the edges where balance was most fragile. Festivals provided moments when the divine presence moved beyond temple walls and into public life. During these events, statues of gods were carried in processions through streets and along the river, allowing ordinary people to witness and participate in sacred renewal. Music, dance, and offerings accompanied these rituals, blending joy with reverence. Festivals reinforced unity, reminding communities that the gods belonged to the land as a whole, not to a single city or class. The king held a unique position within this sacred system. As the earthly representative of the gods, he served as the bridge between divine and human realms. His role was not to replace the gods, but to act on their behalf, assuring that rituals were performed and temples maintained. Reliefs carved into temple walls depicted the king offering gifts to the gods, reaffirming his responsibility to uphold Ma'at. These images were not displays of personal devotion, but visual affirmations of cosmic order, repeated generation after generation. For ordinary Egyptians, religious belief was deeply personal yet quietly expressed. Small household shrines, amulets, and protective symbols brought the presence of the gods into daily life. People prayed for health, protection, fertility, and safe passage through both life and death. Religion was not experienced as a set of rigid doctrines, but as a living relationship with forces that governed existence. Faith was practiced through repetition, consistency, and trust rather than dramatic revelation. Through its gods and temples, ancient Egypt created a spiritual framework that mirrored its physical world. Order was preserved through ritual, continuity was maintained through tradition, and meaning was found through alignment with forces greater than the individual. The sacred landscape did not dominate life, but quietly supported it, offering reassurance that as long as rituals were maintained and balance respected, the world would continue as it always had, stable, predictable, and enduring beneath the eternal sky. Life in ancient Egypt unfolded not in sudden moments of drama or constant struggle, but through steady routines shaped by the river, the land, and the expectations of community. For most people, existence was defined by familiar patterns repeated day after day, season after season, and it was within these patterns that meaning, security, and identity were found. The Nile did not simply determine when crops were planted or harvested, It shaped how homes were built, how families organized themselves, how labor was shared, and how individuals understood their place within the wider world. Homes along the Nile were built with practicality rather than display. Most were constructed from sun-dried mud brick, formed from the same fertile earth that sustained agriculture. These houses were modest in size, often consisting of a few rooms arranged around a small courtyard that allowed light and air to circulate. Flat roofs provided space for storage or sleeping during the hottest months, while thick walls insulated interiors from the intense heat of the day and retained warmth at night. Furniture was simple but functional: wooden stools, reed mats, low tables, and storage chests that held clothing, tools, and personal items. The home was not a place of isolation, but a space deeply connected to the surrounding community. Daily life began early, guided by the rising sun. Farmers moved to the fields while the air was still cool, tending crops of wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables that thrived in the fertile soil left by the flood. Irrigation channels carried water carefully across fields, and maintaining these canals was a shared responsibility. A blocked channel or damaged embankment could affect entire neighborhoods, reinforcing the importance of cooperation. Work was steady rather than frantic, paced by natural rhythms rather than imposed deadlines. Beyond agriculture, a wide range of occupations sustained Egyptian society. Craftsmen shaped pottery, wove linen from flax, carved wood, worked stone, and produced tools from copper and bronze. Each craft followed established techniques passed down through generations, ensuring consistency and quality. Artisans often worked in small workshops attached to homes or temples, and their labor supported both everyday needs and large communal projects. Fishing, hunting birds in the marshes, and gathering papyrus supplemented diets and provided materials for trade and writing. Trade linked villages and cities along the Nile, turning the river into a living highway. Boats moved grain, stone, pottery, and finished goods between regions, allowing resources to flow where they were needed. Markets offered opportunities for exchange, though much of the economy operated through redistribution managed by temples and administrative centers. Grain served as a primary measure of value, used to pay laborers, support officials, and provide security during lean years. This system reinforced stability, ensuring that resources circulated rather than accumulated excessively in private hands. Family formed the core of social life. Households often included extended family members, and responsibilities were shared across generations. Marriage was seen as a practical and emotional partnership, essential for maintaining the household and continuing family lines. Women held respected roles within society, managing households, raising children, and participating in economic life through weaving, food production, and trade. While social hierarchies existed, daily life for most people emphasized mutual dependence rather than strict separation. Children grew up learning through observation and participation rather than formal instruction. Boys followed their fathers or elders into fields, workshops, or administrative roles, while girls learned household skills from mothers and relatives. Education for scribes was more formal and demanding, requiring years of training and discipline, but for most, knowledge was transmitted through repetition and experience. Stories, proverbs, and shared memory reinforced cultural values and expectations. Community life extended beyond the household into shared spaces and activities. Festivals, religious rituals, and seasonal events brought people together, reinforcing bonds and providing moments of collective joy and reflection. Music, dance, and storytelling played important roles, offering relief from labor and strengthening social cohesion. Even funerary practices reflected community involvement, as neighbors and relatives participated in rituals that honored the dead and supported the living. Social order was maintained through custom, tradition, and shared belief rather than constant enforcement. Disputes were often resolved locally, guided by elders or officials who sought to restore balance rather than assign blame. Respect for might influenced everyday behavior, encouraging fairness, honesty, and restraint. While hardship existed, illness, loss, and difficult floods, the overall structure of society provided resilience, allowing people to endure challenges without losing stability. The relationship between work and rest was carefully balanced. During the inundation season, when fields lay beneath water, agricultural labor paused, and people turned to construction, maintenance, and communal projects. This seasonal shift prevented exhaustion and allowed skills beyond farming to flourish. Life was not defined by endless labor, but by adaptation to natural cycles that provided both productivity and pause. Through these rhythms of home, work, and community, ancient Egyptian society cultivated endurance rather than excess. People found security not in constant change, but in repetition and shared responsibility. Each individual played a role within a larger system that valued balance and cooperation. It was this quiet strength, rooted in daily life along the Nile, that allowed Egyptian civilization to persist for thousands of years, sustained not only by kings and temples, but by ordinary people whose steady routines carried the weight of history forward, generation after generation. As ancient Egyptian society expanded in scale and complexity, memory alone was no longer sufficient to sustain the delicate balance that held the civilization together. The rhythms of the Nile, the coordination of labor, the distribution of grain, the performance of rituals, and the continuity of authority all required something more enduring than spoken word. From this need emerged one of Egypt's most powerful and lasting contributions to human history: writing. Writing did not appear suddenly as a tool for storytelling or self-expression, but as a practical response to order, a way to preserve memory, regulate life, and extend human intention across time and space. The earliest forms of Egyptian writing developed alongside administration. As fields expanded and surplus grew, resources needed to be counted, recorded, and managed fairly. Grain entering and leaving granaries, labor assigned to state projects, offerings delivered to temples, and taxes collected from villages all required reliable documentation. Writing transformed information into something stable, something that could outlast the moment in which it was created. In doing so, it allowed the state to function smoothly without constant physical presence, enabling decisions made in one place to shape life far away. From these early records emerged hieroglyphs, a writing system unlike any other. Hieroglyphs combine images, sounds, and symbolic meaning into a single, layered form of communication. Some signs represented objects directly, others conveyed sounds, and still others carried conceptual meaning. This flexibility allowed writing to serve both practical and sacred purposes. A single inscription could record a delivery of grain while also invoking divine order. Writing did not merely describe reality, it reinforced it. Alongside hieroglyphs, more simplified scripts developed for everyday use. Hieratic, a cursive form of writing, allowed scribes to record information quickly on papyrus, pottery shards, and wooden tablets. This script supported the daily machinery of administration, correspondence, and accounting. Writing became the silent foundation of governance, invisible to most, yet shaping nearly every aspect of organized life. Without it, large-scale coordination would have been impossible. Scribes occupied a unique and respected position within society. Their training was demanding, requiring years of disciplined study, memorization, and practice. Young students copied texts repeatedly, learning not only the forms of signs, but the values embedded within them. Scribes were taught precision, restraint, and obedience to tradition. Errors were not simply mistakes, but disruptions to order. To write correctly was to act in accordance with might, preserving balance through clarity and accuracy. The power of writing extended far beyond administration. Religious texts recorded hymns, prayers, and ritual instructions, ensuring that ceremonies were performed exactly as intended. Funerary texts guided the dead through the afterlife, preserving knowledge that could not be entrusted to memory alone. Royal inscriptions declared achievements, reinforced legitimacy, and connected the king's reign to the eternal order of the cosmos. Through writing, human actions were fixed in time, protected from forgetting. Writing also reshaped the concept of memory itself. In Egypt, to be remembered was to continue existing. Names carved in stone or written on papyrus allowed individuals to persist beyond death. This belief gave writing a deeply personal and spiritual dimension. Tomb inscriptions recorded names, titles, and offerings, ensuring that the deceased would be recognized and sustained in the afterlife. Forgetting a name was seen as a form of erasure, while recording it was an act of preservation. The materials of writing reflected the civilization's relationship with its environment. Papyrus, made from reeds harvested along the Nile, became the primary writing surface. Lightweight and portable, it allowed information to travel easily along the river's trade routes. Ink, made from natural pigments, flowed smoothly across the surface, while reed pens provided control and precision. Writing tools were simple, yet their impact was profound, transforming natural materials into carriers of time. Texts were carefully stored, copied, and transmitted across generations. Libraries attached to temples and administrative centers preserved knowledge accumulated over centuries. Scribes acted as guardians of this memory, ensuring continuity even as rulers changed and cities rose or fell. Through copying, texts remained alive, adapting subtly while retaining their core structure. This process reinforced stability rather than innovation, preserving what was known to work. Writing also shaped how Egyptians understood history. Events were not recorded as isolated moments, but as part of an ongoing pattern. Victories were framed as restorations of order, disasters as temporary disruptions to balance. The past was not something distant, but something active, guiding the present. By recording events within a familiar framework, writing reinforced the belief that the world remained fundamentally stable, even amid change. For most people, writing remained inaccessible, its symbols mysterious and powerful. This distance enhanced its authority. Written words carried weight precisely because they were rare and controlled. A written decree, a recorded judgment, or a carved inscription possessed permanence that spoken words lacked. Writing could not be argued with or forgotten easily. It stood as evidence, memory made visible. Through writing, ancient Egypt extended its influence across time. Thousands of years later, inscriptions still speak, preserving voices that would otherwise have vanished. The careful recording of ritual, administration, and belief allowed the civilization to endure beyond its political lifespan. Writing became the vessel through which order was maintained, memory preserved, and identity sustained. In this way, writing was far more than a tool. It was a force that shaped how Egyptians understood existence itself. By fixing words, names, and actions in lasting form, they learned to think beyond the immediate moment. Memory became structured, time became navigable, and continuity became possible. Through the power of record, ancient Egypt secured its place not only in its own present, but in the distant future, ensuring that even as centuries passed, its voice would remain steady, deliberate, and enduring. For the people of ancient Egypt, death was not an ending, nor was it a rupture that severed life from meaning. Instead, it was understood as a transition, a passage from one state of existence into another, governed by the same principles of balance, order, and continuity that shaped life along the Nile. The certainty of death did not inspire fear so much as preparation, but the Egyptians believed that how one lived, how one was remembered, and how one was cared for after death determined the quality of existence beyond it. In this way, the afterlife was not a distant abstraction, but a continuation of life itself, structured, familiar, and deeply intertwined with daily behavior. This belief arose naturally from the rhythms of the environment. Just as the Nile disappeared beneath floodwaters only to return renewed, and just as crops died back before rising again from the soil, life too was seen as cyclical rather than linear. Death mirrored the setting sun, which vanished each evening only to rise again at dawn. The journey beyond life was imagined not as darkness, but as passage through a hidden realm toward renewal. This understanding shaped one of the most intricate belief systems of the ancient world, where death demanded care, precision, and reverence. Central to this worldview was the concept of the human soul as something complex and multifaceted. Egyptians did not believe that a person was defined by a single, indivisible spirit. Instead, identity was composed of several interconnected elements, each with its own role in life and after death. The body remained essential, serving as an anchor for the soul's components. The car represented vital life force, sustained through offerings. The ba embodied personality and movement, able to travel between worlds. The act symbolized the transformed, effective spirit, achieved only through proper ritual and moral conduct. These elements had to remain united for eternal life to be possible. Because the body was so essential, preservation became a sacred duty. From this belief emerged the practice of mummification, one of the most recognizable aspects of Egyptian culture. Mummification was not a single act, but a careful process developed and refined over centuries. The body was washed, purified, and treated with natron to remove moisture. Organs were carefully removed, preserved, and stored, while the body itself was wrapped in layers of linen, each applied with ritual intent. Amulets were placed among the wrappings to protect the deceased, and prayers were spoken to guide the soul safely through the journey ahead. This process was not reserved only for royalty. While the wealthy received more elaborate treatment, the underlying belief extended across society. Tombs served as eternal homes rather than places of mourning. Early burials were simple pits in the desert, where dry sand naturally preserved bodies. Over time, these evolved into mastabas, then into rock-cut tombs and pyramids for kings. Regardless of scale, the purpose remained the same: to provide a stable, protected environment where the deceased could continue to exist. Tombs were stocked with food, tools, furniture, and personal items, ensuring comfort and familiarity in the next world. Walls were decorated with scenes of daily life, farming, feasting, and family gatherings, reinforcing the idea that the afterlife mirrored the best aspects of earthly existence. The journey beyond death was believed to involve judgment, a moment where moral conduct mattered deeply. At the heart of this belief stood the weighing of the heart. The deceased would stand before Osiris, ruler of the afterlife, as their heart was weighed against the feather of Mot. The heart, seen as the seat of memory and conscience, carried the record of one's actions. If it balanced evenly with the feather, the individual was judged righteous and allowed to enter the field of reeds, a perfected version of the Nile Valley where life continued eternally. If it failed, the heart was devoured and existence ended completely. This judgment reinforced ethical behavior during life, reminding individuals that balance and truth mattered beyond the present moment. Funerary texts played a crucial role in guiding the dead. Spells, prayers, and instructions were inscribed on coffins, walls, and papyrus scrolls, offering protection and knowledge for the journey. These texts evolved over time, from the pyramid texts reserved for kings, to the coffin texts accessible to officials, and later the Book of the Dead, which extended guidance to a wider population. The presence of these texts reveals a democratization of the afterlife, where eternal life became achievable not only through status, but through proper ritual and moral alignment. The living played an ongoing role in sustaining the dead. Offerings of food, drink, and incense were presented at tombs, nourishing the ka and maintaining connection between worlds. Speaking the name of the deceased was itself an act of preservation. ensuring continued existence through memory. Forgetting a name was feared as a second death, a loss more final than physical passing. In this way, remembrance became a sacred duty, binding families across generations. Death also shaped architecture and labor. Monumental tombs and pyramids were not built as displays of arrogance, but as expressions of cosmic order and continuity. Their alignment with stars, cardinal directions, and sacred landscapes reflected beliefs about the soul's journey and the eternal nature of kingship. The labor required to build them was often seasonal, carried out during the flood when agricultural work paused, allowing communities to contribute without disrupting survival. These projects reinforced unity, purpose, and shared belief rather than exploitation. For ordinary Egyptians, beliefs about death offered comfort rather than fear. Life was demanding, unpredictable, and finite, but the promise of continuation provided reassurance. The afterlife was not imagined as an alien realm, but as a familiar world free from hardship, where fields were fertile, work was effortless, and loved ones were reunited. This vision encouraged endurance, patience, and acceptance of life's challenges. Through their understanding of death, the Egyptians revealed their deepest values. They believed that life had meaning because it was part of a larger cycle, that actions mattered beyond the present, and that balance governed all things. Death did not erase identity, it tested and transformed it. By preparing carefully for the journey beyond, the people of ancient Egypt affirmed their trust in order, continuity, and renewal. In doing so, they created one of the most enduring and intricate visions of the afterlife in human history, a vision that continues to shape how we understand mortality, memory, and the quiet hope of continuation beyond the visible world. In ancient Egypt, art was never created for decoration alone, nor was it meant to capture fleeting moments or personal emotion in the way later traditions would. Instead, Egyptian art functioned as a language, a carefully structured system of visual expression designed to preserve order, convey meaning, and make the invisible forces of the world visible and stable. Every carved relief, painted wall, sculpted statue, and crafted object served a purpose that extended beyond beauty. Art was a tool for continuity, a method of fixing reality into a form that could endure across time, death, and change. This approach to art grew directly from the Egyptian understanding of the universe. Just as might govern balance and order in nature and society, artistic creation followed strict principles that ensured clarity, harmony, and permanence. The goal was not innovation for its own sake, but correctness. To depict something properly was to help it exist properly. An image, once created according to established rules, became more than representation. It became participation in reality itself. From the earliest periods, Egyptian artists worked within conventions that remain remarkably consistent for thousands of years. Human figures were shown in a composite view, heads and legs in profile, torsos facing forward, eyes wide and fully visible. This was not a lack of skill or imagination, but a deliberate choice. Each part of the body was shown from its most recognizable angle, creating an image that was complete rather than momentary. The aim was not to show how a person looked at a specific instant, but how a person was, in essence. Timelessness mattered more than realism. Scale within art carried meaning rather than perspective. Important figures were shown larger than others, regardless of physical distance. Kings towered over officials, gods loomed larger than kings, and servants appeared smaller, not because of where they stood, but because of who they were. Hierarchy was visualized clearly and without ambiguity. This allowed anyone viewing the image to understand social and cosmic order instantly, reinforcing the structure of society through sight alone. Materials were chosen with care, each carrying symbolic and practical significance. Stone was favored for statues and temple reliefs meant to last forever. Limestone, sandstone, granite, and basalt were shaped with patience and precision, often polished until surfaces caught and reflected light. Wood, more fragile, was used for household items, coffins, and smaller statues. Metals such as copper, bronze, silver, and gold were worked into tools, jewelry, and ritual objects. Gold, associated with the flesh of the gods and the eternal sun, symbolized immortality and divine perfection. Color played a powerful role in Egyptian art. Pigments were made from natural minerals, ground and mixed carefully to achieve consistency and longevity. Red symbolized vitality, power, and sometimes chaos. Blue and green represented water, fertility, and rebirth. White conveyed purity and sacredness, while black symbolized the fertile soil of the Nile and the promise of regeneration. These colors were not chosen for personal preference, but for meaning, applied intentionally to reinforce the message of the image. Artisans worked within workshops attached to temples, palaces, and settlements. These workshops were centers of skill, discipline, and transmission of knowledge. Techniques were passed down through apprenticeship, with younger craftsmen learning by copying established forms again and again until precision became instinctive. Individual creativity existed, but it was subtle, expressed through refinement rather than deviation. Consistency ensured that art remained intelligible across generations, preserving shared understanding. Sculpture held particular importance in Egyptian belief. Statues were not merely likenesses, but potential vessels for spiritual presence. A statue of a god allowed that god to inhabit the physical world. A statue of a deceased individual provided a backup home for the soul should the body be damaged. For this reason, statues were carved with calm expressions, idealized forms, and symmetrical balance. They were meant to be stable, eternal, and receptive, capable of enduring indefinitely. Relief carvings and wall paintings transformed tombs and temples into narratives of continuity. In tombs, scenes of agriculture, hunting, feasting, and family life filled walls with images of abundance and familiarity. These scenes were not nostalgic memories, but active provisions for the afterlife. What was shown was believed to continue. A painted loaf of bread could nourish the soul, a carved servant could continue working, a depicted harvest could be eternally renewed. Temples used art to communicate cosmic order. Walls depicted gods receiving offerings, kings performing rituals, and enemies subdued not for historical record alone, but to affirm the triumph of order over chaos. These scenes were repeated endlessly, reinforcing stability through repetition. Even when historical circumstances changed, the imagery remained consistent, asserting that mod endured regardless of temporary disruption. Craft extended beyond monumental art into everyday life. Pottery, furniture, tools, and clothing were produced with attention to proportion and balance. Decorative patterns followed established motifs: lotus flowers, papyrus reeds, geometric designs, and protective symbols. Jewelry combined beauty with protection, incorporating amulets shaped like scarabs, eyes, and divine figures. These objects were worn not only for adornment, but to carry meaning and safeguard the wearer. Writing itself was a form of art. Hieroglyphs were arranged with visual harmony in mind, balanced in space, oriented carefully, and often integrated into images. A text was not simply read, it was seen. This fusion of image and word reinforced the idea that communication itself was part of cosmic order. To write correctly was to act in harmony with the universe. The role of the artist in Egyptian society was respected but restrained. Artists rarely signed their work. Individual recognition mattered less than collective continuity. What endured was the form, not the name. This anonymity reflected the broader worldview, where the individual found meaning through alignment with something larger and longer lasting than personal identity. Over centuries, Egyptian art influenced neighboring cultures through trade, diplomacy, and conquest. Its emphasis on clarity, symbolism, and permanence left a lasting impression. Yet within Egypt itself, change came slowly. Even as dynasties shifted and foreign rulers appeared, artistic conventions persisted. New elements were absorbed carefully, integrated without disrupting the established visual language. This endurance reveals the true purpose of Egyptian art. It was not meant to surprise or provoke, but to stabilize. It reassured viewers that the world remained intelligible and ordered. In a landscape shaped by cycles of flood and drought, life and death, Egyptian art offered continuity. It fixed moments into eternity, turning stone, pigment, and metal into anchors against forgetting. Through art and craft, the Egyptians shaped how they were seen by the future, but more importantly, how they understood themselves. Their images do not shout or demand attention. They speak quietly, patiently, through balance and repetition. They tell a story of a civilization that believed reality could be sustained through form, that order could be preserved through careful creation, and that beauty lay not in novelty, but in harmony that endured long after hands fell silent and time moved on. Although the Nile formed the central spine of Egyptian life, ancient Egypt was never a world sealed within its own fertile valley. From its earliest periods, the civilization looked outward, cautiously yet deliberately, extending lines of movement, exchange, and influence beyond the river banks and into the deserts, mountains, and seas that surrounded it. Trade and travel were not pursued for expansion or conquest alone, but as necessities of balance. Egypt possessed abundance in grain and stability and rhythm, yet it lacked many resources essential for long-term continuity. To remain whole, it had to connect. The Nile itself made this outward movement possible. Flowing northward toward the sea and navigable in both directions with the aid of wind and current, it became a natural highway that unified the land internally and linked it to distant regions externally. Boats moved steadily along its surface, carrying grain, stone, pottery, textiles, and people between settlements. Travel along the river was predictable and comparatively safe, allowing Egypt to develop internal cohesion long before many other civilizations. This mastery of river travel laid the foundation for journeys beyond familiar territory. Beyond the green ribbon of the valley lay the desert, vast, silent, and dangerous. To the Egyptians, the desert was not empty, but alive with meaning. It represented chaos, transition, and testing, yet it also concealed vital resources. Copper, gold, turquoise, and precious stones lay hidden beneath its surface. Trade routes extended eastward into the Sinai Peninsula, where turquoise and copper were mined under state supervision. These expeditions were difficult and often perilous, requiring careful planning, water management, and protection. Reliefs carved into rock faces record these journeys, depicting officials, workers, and guards moving through harsh landscapes, asserting order within chaos. To the south, Egypt reached into Nubia, a region rich in gold, ebony, ivory, incense, and exotic animal products. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia evolved over time, shifting between trade, diplomacy, and conflict. Early interactions were often based on exchange, with Nubian communities providing resources that Egypt could not produce, while receiving grain, manufactured goods, and cultural influence in return. Over centuries, these interactions deepened, shaping both societies. Egyptian forts and trading posts appeared along the Nile's southern reaches, marking points of control and contact rather than simple domination. To the east, routes extended toward the Red Sea, opening paths to lands even farther away. Expeditions traveled to Punt, a region remembered as a place of abundance, source of incense, myrrh, gold, exotic animals, and precious woods. Punt was not merely a trading partner, but a place imbued with symbolic significance, often described as sacred or divinely favored. Reliefs depicting these journeys show ships laden with goods, plants being transported for cultivation, and emissaries returning with treasures that enrich temple rituals and royal authority. These voyages reveal Egypt's capacity for maritime travel and its willingness to engage with distant cultures without permanent settlement or conquest. To the north, Egypt encountered the Mediterranean world. Trade with the Levant brought cedar wood from Lebanon, essential for shipbuilding and monumental architecture. Wine, oil, silver, and crafted goods moved into Egypt, while grain, papyrus, linen, and manufactured items flowed outward. These exchanges were not random, but regulated through diplomacy, treaties, and administrative oversight. Trade reinforced political relationships and cultural awareness, allowing Egypt to position itself as a stable center within a wider network rather than an isolated kingdom. Caravans crossed land routes linking Egypt to oases scattered across the western desert. These oases served as way stations, sources of water, and hubs of regional exchange. Travelers moved slowly, guided by stars, landmarks, and inherited knowledge of terrain. These journeys required trust and experience rather than maps, reinforcing the importance of memory and oral tradition. Each successful expedition strengthened Egypt's understanding of its wider environment and reduced the fear associated with the unknown. Trade was not conducted by merchants acting independently, but was largely overseen by the state. Temples and royal administration controlled major exchanges, ensuring that goods were distributed according to need and ritual requirement. This centralized approach prevented extreme inequality and maintained stability. Foreign goods often entered Egypt through official channels, becoming offerings to the gods or resources for construction before circulating into broader use. Trade, like agriculture, was integrated into the moral framework of Ma'at, expected to be fair, measured, and balanced. Travel also facilitated cultural exchange. Ideas, technologies, artistic motifs, and religious concepts moved alongside goods. Foreign deities were sometimes adopted or associated with Egyptian gods. Artistic styles showed subtle influences from neighboring regions, absorbed carefully into existing conventions. Writing systems, military equipment, and architectural techniques evolved through contact, yet Egypt maintained its core identity, adapting without losing continuity. Diplomacy became an extension of trade. Gifts exchanged between rulers reinforced alliances and mutual recognition. Letters preserved on clay tablets record correspondence between Egyptian kings and foreign courts, revealing a world connected through respect, negotiation, and shared interest. Egypt was seen as a land of stability and abundance, a reliable partner rather than a volatile power. This reputation enhanced its influence far beyond its borders. Travel also held symbolic meaning. Journeys into foreign lands mirrored spiritual transitions, movements from order into chaos and back again. Successful return reinforced the idea that Ma'at could be extended beyond familiar boundaries. Explorers, traders, and officials who ventured outward embodied courage tempered by discipline. Their experiences enriched collective understanding, bringing back knowledge of climates, peoples, and customs that expanded Egypt's sense of place in the world. For ordinary Egyptians, trade and travel shaped daily life indirectly. Foreign goods appeared in markets, temples displayed exotic offerings, and stories of distant lands circulated through communities. These influences broadened imagination without disrupting routine. Egypt remained rooted in its valley, yet aware that the world extended far beyond it. Over centuries, Egypt's trade networks waxed and waned with political strength, yet the impulse to connect endured. Even during periods of fragmentation, routes remained active and exchange continued. This persistence reflects a civilization that understood isolation as imbalance. To thrive, Egypt needed both inward stability and outward connection. Through trade and travel, ancient Egypt positioned itself within a wider human story. It did not seek constant expansion, but integration. Its journeys were deliberate, its exchanges measured, and its relationships shaped by long-term thinking rather than immediate gain. By reaching beyond the Nile while remaining anchored to it, Egypt achieved a rare balance: openness without loss of identity, connection without surrender of order. In this way, movement became another form of continuity. Goods flowed, people traveled, ideas circulated, yet the rhythm of the river remained unchanged. Trade did not pull Egypt away from itself, but reinforced what it already was: a civilization confident enough in its foundation to engage with the wider world, knowing that no matter how far ships sailed or caravans wandered, it would always return to the steady banks of the Nile, where order waited patiently, enduring beyond distance and time. For much of its long history, ancient Egypt was shaped less by constant warfare than by the careful avoidance of chaos. Unlike civilizations that define themselves through relentless expansion or perpetual conflict, Egypt viewed war as a disturbance of balance rather than a natural state of existence. Conflict was not glorified for its own sake, nor was it pursued as an expression of identity. Instead, war emerged when order was threatened, when boundaries were crossed, or when the stability that sustained life along the Nile required protection. In this way, warfare in Egypt was understood as a corrective force, an effort to restore might rather than to disrupt it. The geography of Egypt played a crucial role in shaping this perspective. The Nile Valley was naturally protected on all sides. To the east and west lay vast deserts that were difficult to cross and hostile to large armies. To the south, the river narrowed and flowed through rocky terrain, while to the north, the Mediterranean Sea formed a natural barrier. These features insulated Egypt from frequent invasion and allowed it to develop with relative security. Because threats were sporadic rather than constant, Egyptian society did not become militarized in the same way as some neighboring cultures. Soldiers existed, but they were not a permanent ruling class, and warfare was not the primary organizing principle of society. In the earliest periods, defense was local and communal. Villages relied on watchfulness, cooperation, and natural barriers rather than standing armies. Fortifications were minimal, often consisting of walls around key settlements or natural choke points along trade routes. Weapons were simple: spears, clubs, bows, and shields made from wood, stone, and copper. These tools were used as much for hunting and protection as for combat. Conflict at this stage was limited in scale, often involving disputes over resources or boundaries rather than large-scale campaigns. As Egypt unified and centralized authority strengthened, the nature of warfare evolved. The king, as guardian of Ma'at, became responsible for defending the land against forces of chaos, both human and symbolic. Enemies were not viewed simply as opposing peoples, but as embodiments of disorder threatening the balance of the cosmos. This worldview shaped how war was recorded and remembered. Reliefs carved into temple walls depict the king defeating enemies in idealized scenes, not as historical records of battle tactics, but as symbolic affirmations of order triumphing over chaos. The purpose of these images was reassurance rather than intimidation. Military organization developed gradually. Soldiers were often drawn from the general population, serving seasonally rather than permanently. During periods when agricultural work paused, such as the inundation season, men could be mobilized for defense or construction. This system ensured that warfare did not disrupt food production or daily life. Officers were appointed based on experience and loyalty, and while discipline was important, the military remained closely tied to civilian society. Weapons and armor reflected Egypt's practical approach to conflict. Early equipment was lightweight and adaptable, suited to mobility rather than prolonged siege warfare. Bows were especially valued, allowing soldiers to engage enemies at a distance. Shields made from animal hide or wood provided protection without excessive weight. Over time, contact with other cultures introduced new technologies, including improved metalworking techniques and different weapon forms. These innovations were adopted carefully, integrated without overturning existing practices. defense extended beyond the battlefield into strategic geography. Fortresses were constructed along Egypt's borders, particularly in Nubia and the Sinai, to control trade routes and monitor movement. These forts were not merely military installations, but administrative centers that regulated exchange and enforced stability. Garrisons stationed there represented the state's presence at the edges of order, standing between the cultivated land and the unknown beyond. Their role was as much symbolic as practical, marking the boundary where Ma'at ended and chaos began. The new kingdom marked a significant shift in Egypt's relationship with warfare. External pressures increased as neighboring powers grew stronger and more organized. The Hyksos period demonstrated the vulnerability of Egypt to foreign rule, introducing new military technology such as horse-drawn chariots and composite bows. This experience reshaped Egyptian attitudes toward defense. When native rule was restored, Egypt adopted and refined these technologies, transforming its military capabilities. Chariots became symbols of royal power and mobility, allowing rapid movement across battlefields and desert terrain. Armies became more professional, with dedicated units trained for extended campaigns. Egypt expanded its influence into Nubia and the Levant, not solely for conquest, but to establish buffer zones that protected the heartland. These campaigns were framed as acts of defense and restoration rather than aggression, justified through the language of Ma'at. Despite this expansion, Egypt never fully embraced militarism as a cultural ideal. Victories were celebrated, but the ultimate goal remained stability rather than domination. Foreign territories were administered through treaties, alliances, and vassal systems rather than direct occupation whenever possible. Tribute replaced constant warfare, allowing resources to flow without continuous conflict. Diplomacy and gift exchange often proved more effective than force, reinforcing Egypt's reputation as a stable and reliable power. Within Egyptian society, soldiers did not occupy an exalted position above others. While bravery was respected, military service was one role among many that supported order. Farmers, scribes, priests, and craftsmen were equally essential. This balance prevented the rise of a warrior elite detached from civilian life. Even kings were depicted not only as warriors, but as priests, judges, and caretakers of the land. The language of war in Egyptian texts reveals this restrained attitude. Enemies are described as chaotic, rebellious, or misguided rather than inherently evil. Victory restores order rather than annihilates opposition. Even scenes of violence are stylized and symbolic, emphasizing control rather than brutality. This narrative reinforced the idea that force was a last resort, justified only when harmony was threatened. War also carried spiritual dimensions. Before campaigns, rituals were performed to seek divine favor. Gods were consulted, omens interpreted, and offerings made. Success in battle was attributed not solely to strategy or strength, but to alignment with Ma'at. Failure signaled imbalance, prompting reflection and correction rather than blind retaliation. This integration of belief and action restrained excess and reinforced accountability. For ordinary Egyptians, warfare was distant from daily life for much of history. Battles were fought on borders or foreign lands, while the valley remained focused on agriculture, ritual, and community. When war did intrude, through raids or conscription, it was experienced as disruption rather than glory. The collective memory of conflict reinforced the value of peace and order, strengthening cultural commitment to stability. Over time, Egypt's military power rose and fell with political unity. Periods of strong central authority enabled effective defense and controlled expansion. Periods of fragmentation weakened borders and invited external influence. Yet throughout these changes, the underlying philosophy remained consistent. War was a tool, not an identity. Defense existed to preserve balance, not to redefine it. In understanding Egyptian warfare, we see a civilization deeply committed to boundaries, both physical and symbolic. The boundary between cultivated land and desert, order and chaos, peace and conflict was carefully guarded. Soldiers stood at these edges, not as conquerors, but as guardians. Their purpose was to ensure that life along the Nile could continue undisturbed, following its ancient rhythms. Through restraint, strategy, and integration of belief, ancient Egypt maintained stability for millennia. Its approach to war reflects a broader worldview that valued endurance over domination. By treating conflict as a temporary disturbance rather than a permanent condition, Egypt preserved its core identity even as the world around it changed. In doing so, it demonstrated that true strength lies not in constant aggression, but in the ability to protect balance, maintain boundaries, and return always to order after chaos has passed. For the people of ancient Egypt, time was not experienced as a straight line moving relentlessly forward, carrying the past away and leaving it behind. Instead, time was understood as something circular, rhythmic, and deeply familiar, a force that moves through repetition rather than rupture. Days followed nights, seasons followed floods, generations followed one another, and through all of it ran the reassuring belief that what had happened before would happen again. This understanding shaped not only how Egyptians lived, but how they remembered, planned, built, and imagined their place within the vast unfolding of existence. The natural world taught this lesson first. The Nile rose and fell with dependable regularity. The sun emerged each morning after its nightly journey through darkness. The stars returned to the same positions in the sky, marking seasons and guiding rituals. These cycles did not suggest progress or decline, but renewal. What disappeared was not lost forever, it was simply waiting to return. From this perspective, change was not feared, but absorbed, for it unfolded within an order that endured beyond any single lifetime. This cyclical sense of time shaped Egyptian psychology in profound ways. Urgency was tempered by patience. Ambition was restrained by continuity. The goal of life was not to outpace the future, but to align oneself with patterns that were already eternal. Innovation was approached cautiously, measured against tradition and tested by time. What had endured was trusted. What disrupted balance was viewed with suspicion. This worldview encouraged stability over speed, memory over novelty, and preservation over transformation. Memory, therefore, was not passive recollection but an active force that sustained existence. To remember was to keep something alive. Names spoken aloud, rituals repeated precisely, texts copied carefully, and images carved into stone were all acts of preservation. Forgetting, by contrast, was dangerous. To be forgotten was to lose one's place in the order of the world. This belief explains the Egyptian obsession with recording names, titles, and lineage, especially in funerary contexts. Memory ensured continuity not only for individuals, but for society itself. Writing became one of the most powerful tools through which time could be navigated. Text allowed knowledge to pass from generation to generation without distortion. Ritual instructions ensured ceremonies were performed exactly as intended centuries after their creation. Administrative records preserved systems of governance even as rulers changed. History was not written to analyze or critique the past, but to reinforce the present by showing how order had been restored before. Events were framed as renewals rather than beginnings, corrections rather than revolutions. Architecture served a similar function. Stone temples, tombs, and monuments were not designed for the moment, but for eternity. Their massive scale was not merely a display of power, but an assertion that continuity mattered more than lifespan. These structures anchored memory into the landscape itself. Even when political authority shifted or cities declined, the monuments remained, silently asserting that order had once existed here and could exist again. They reminded future generations that time could be endured, not just survived. The king occupied a unique position within this temporal framework. He was not simply a ruler of people, but a stabilizing presence within time itself. Each king presented himself as the restorer of Ma'at, correcting imbalances left behind by his predecessors. His reign was not portrayed as a new chapter, but as the continuation of an eternal pattern. Even in death, kings joined a lineage that stretched backward to the first rulers and forward into the unknown future. Kingship was not individual achievement, but participation in a timeless role. Ritual reinforced this continuity daily. Temple ceremonies followed the same sequence each morning. Offerings were presented in prescribed order. Hymns were recited with exact wording. These repetitions were not empty routines, but deliberate acts that held the universe together. By repeating what had always been done, priests ensured that what had always happened would continue to happen. Change was allowed only within carefully maintained boundaries, preventing chaos from gaining a foothold. This approach to time shaped Egyptian attitudes toward hardship and uncertainty. Floods sometimes failed. Crops were occasionally lost. Dynasties collapsed. Yet these events were understood as temporary disruptions rather than permanent endings. History had taught that order could be restored, that imbalance could be corrected. This belief fostered resilience. Instead of panic or despair, people responded to crisis with ritual, reform, and patience. The future was not unknown, it was remembered. Education reinforced this worldview. Scribes copied ancient texts repeatedly, internalizing not only knowledge but respect for what had endured. Artists followed established conventions, ensuring visual continuity across centuries. Craftsmen preserved techniques with minimal alteration. Through repetition, skill became memory, and memory became identity. Each generation inherited not only tools and texts, but a way of understanding time itself. Even personal identity was shaped by this continuity. Individuals understood themselves as part of a long chain rather than isolated figures. Family lineage, community roles, and ancestral memory mattered deeply. To honor one's parents, maintain household traditions, and preserve the family name was to participate in eternity. The self was not defined by uniqueness, but by connection. Death, too, was understood within this temporal framework. The afterlife was not a break from time, but its extension. The deceased entered a perfected version of the familiar world where fields were fertile, work was effortless, and order was complete. This belief required preparation, memory, and ritual, ensuring that continuity did not end with the body. Tombs became points where past, present, and future met, sustained through offerings and remembrance. Foreign influence and political change tested the system, yet it proved remarkably resilient. Even under foreign rule, Egyptian rituals continued, temples functioned, and belief in Ma'at endured. New rulers adopted Egyptian customs rather than replacing them entirely, recognizing the power of continuity. This adaptability allowed Egyptian culture to survive long after its political independence faded. Time, in the Egyptian view, was not something to conquer or escape. It was something to inhabit. By aligning human life with cosmic rhythms, Egyptians created a civilization capable of enduring immense spans of history without losing its core identity. Their approach offers a contrast to cultures driven by acceleration and disruption. It suggests that longevity is achieved not through constant reinvention, but through careful preservation. In the quiet repetition of daily rituals, in the careful copying of ancient texts, and in the steady presence of monuments along the Nile, ancient Egypt expressed a profound truth. Time does not destroy everything. When guided by balance, memory, and restraint, time becomes a vessel rather than a threat. Through this understanding, Egypt did not merely exist in history. It endured within it, carried forward by continuity that weighed heavily, patiently, and with purpose across the centuries. Centuries passed, and the great dynasties of ancient Egypt slowly gave way to new powers, new rulers, and new names. The civilization itself did not vanish in a moment of collapse or dramatic ending. Instead, it softened gradually, like stone worn smooth by wind and sand, leaving behind traces that continued to shape the world long after political control faded. Egypt did not end so much as it transformed, its influence spreading outward and forward through memory, tradition, and enduring presence. What remained was not merely a collection of ruins, but a way of understanding life, order, and time that echoed far beyond the Nile Valley. Political authority in Egypt changed hands many times. Native dynasties weakened, foreign rulers arrived, and the land passed under the control of Libyans, Nubians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. Each new power brought different systems of governance and new cultural influences, yet none could fully erase what had been established over millennia. Temples continued to function, rituals were still performed, and the rhythms of agricultural life remained tied to the river. Even conquerors who sought control quickly learned that stability in Egypt depended on respecting its traditions rather than replacing them. To rule Egypt was to step into an ancient framework, not to dismantle it. This persistence reveals something essential about Egyptian civilization. Its strength did not lie solely in military power or political dominance, but in the deep integration of belief, environment, and daily life. The Nile continued to flood, crops continued to grow, and communities continued to organize themselves according to patterns that had proven reliable over generations. These rhythms outlasted kings and empires, anchoring identity even as external authority shifted. Egypt endured because it was built upon continuity rather than constant reinvention. The monuments of Egypt played a powerful role in preserving this continuity. Pyramids, temples, obelisks, and tombs remained embedded in the landscape, impossible to ignore. Long after their builders were forgotten, these structures continued to assert the presence of an ancient order. They were repaired, reused, reinterpreted, and sometimes repurposed by later generations, yet they never lost their symbolic weight. To encounter these monuments was to encounter memory-made stone, a physical reminder that time could be resisted, if not defeated. These structures also shaped how later cultures understood the past. Greek travelers marveled at Egypt's antiquity, seeing it as a source of ancient wisdom. Philosophers, historians, and scholars regarded Egypt as older than their own traditions, a land where knowledge had accumulated rather than been lost. Roman rulers admired Egypt's ability to endure and sought to associate themselves with its grandeur. Even when Egypt was absorbed into larger empires, it remained culturally distinct, its identity preserved through ritual, art, and belief. Egypt's influence extended beyond architecture and political thought into religion, philosophy, and symbolism. Ideas about the afterlife, moral judgment, and the balance between order and chaos resonated with later belief systems. The concept that actions carried consequences beyond the present life, that memory sustained existence, and that harmony governed the universe found echoes in traditions far removed from the Nile. These ideas did not transfer directly or unchanged, but they contributed to a broader human conversation about meaning, justice, and continuity. Language and writing also carried Egypt forward through time. Hieroglyphs, though eventually forgotten, remain visible on temple walls and monuments, silently asserting the presence of a literate and ordered past. For centuries, their meaning was lost, yet their form continued to inspire curiosity and reverence. When hieroglyphs were finally deciphered in the modern era, voices long silent spoke again. Names, prayers, laws, and stories emerged from stone and papyrus, restoring depth and humanity to what had seemed distant and mythic. Archaeology transformed Egypt's long echo into renewed presence. Tombs were opened, cities uncovered, and everyday objects revealed details of daily life that monuments alone could not convey. Tools worn smooth by use, toys shaped by hand, letters written in haste, and administrative records preserved moments of ordinary existence. These discoveries reminded the modern world that Egypt was not only a land of gods and kings, but of farmers, craftsmen, families, and children whose lives unfolded quietly within enduring structures. Yet archaeology also revealed the fragility of memory. Sites were damaged, looted, or destroyed. Objects were removed from context. Interpretation was shaped by modern assumptions. Even as knowledge expanded, it became clear that much had been lost forever. This realization reinforced one of Egypt's own lessons, that preservation requires care, attention, and respect. Memory does not survive automatically. It must be maintained. The Nile itself remained the most enduring legacy of all. Long after political borders shifted, the river continued to shape life in the valley. Its floods, though altered by modern intervention, still echoed ancient rhythms. Villages remained oriented toward its banks. Agriculture followed its flow. The landscape remembered what people sometimes forgot. In this way, Egypt's foundation endured in the most literal sense, carried forward by water and soil rather than text or monument. Modern engagement with Egypt reflects both fascination and longing. Egypt represents time at a scale difficult to grasp, a civilization that endured not for centuries, but for millennia. In a world often defined by speed and disruption, Egypt offers an alternative model, one built on patience, balance, and continuity. Its history invites reflection rather than urgency, suggesting that endurance may be achieved not through constant change, but through careful alignment with forces greater than the individual. The long echo of Egypt also carries warnings. Environmental balance, once disrupted, can threaten stability. Social cohesion, once fractured, can weaken even the strongest structures. Egypt's own periods of decline remind us that continuity is not guaranteed, it must be protected. The civilization endured as long as it maintained harmony between land, belief, and governance. When these elements fell out of alignment, fragmentation followed. Yet even then, recovery remained possible, guided by memory rather than reinvention. Ultimately, Egypt's greatest achievement was not any single monument, ruler, or conquest, but the creation of a worldview capable of sustaining itself across vast spans of time. By understanding life as cyclical rather than linear, by valuing balance over excess, and by embedding memory into daily practice, Egypt built a civilization that could absorb change without losing identity. Its legacy lies not only in what it created, but in how it endured. Today, when we look upon the ruins of temples or the outlines of pyramids against the desert sky, we are not merely witnessing the remains of a vanished world. We are encountering the residue of a way of thinking that shaped human history. Egypt's echo persists in how we understand time, memory, death, and order. It reminds us that civilizations are not sustained by speed or spectacle, but by alignment, patience, and respect for the rhythms that govern existence. In this sense, ancient Egypt has never truly disappeared. It continues to speak, quietly and steadily, through stone, through landscape, and through the ideas it released into the world. Its voice does not demand attention, nor does it rush to be heard. It waits, as it always has, confident that time, when guided by balance and memory, will carry its meaning forward.